Sir Edward Davey.
Mr. Speaker, I am most grateful for you allowing me to catch your eye without a written application to the Chair. And if I may, in humbly apologising to you, realise that I had thought the Conservative benches would make speeches in the 2 hours that you had, up to 2 hours that you had allocated to this debate. But we've had not a single speech from the Conservative benches. That's why I hadn't written to you, sir, because I didn't think you would need an extra speech. But I do think it's important that the Conservative benches hear the allegations that are made, because they are very deep allegations. And I would say, I give way to an honourable lady.
I thank the honourable member for giving way, and I would have liked to have spoken in this debate had I not had other matters to be participating in. But isn't it astounding that the only contributions we've heard thus far from the other side have been the whataboutery, trying to draw equivalents with other matters, that actually, on the critical issue that we are addressing today, we've heard nothing. Not one member on the other side has found it in themselves to address this issue, which is at the heart of our democracy.
It is absolutely right. And what is astounding is actually this debate is more than about Brexit. Because the issues being raised in this debate are bigger than Brexit. They're about our democracy, how it works. But they're actually about parliamentary sovereignty and the rule of law. And I had thought that Conservative members, particularly the Brexit Conservatives, had wanted to pull us out of the EU in order to defend parliamentary sovereignty and the rule of law as they describe it. But they're not here to defend that rule of law today, which is what is so shocking about the failure of them to speak and make speeches. I give way to the honourable lady.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. Would he agree that if we ignore this, if we don't take this apart and examine it in full, it is allowing a criminalisation of our democracy? That's what's at risk here, and we must acknowledge that. No matter how inconvenient a truth it is, we must absolutely get to the bottom of this.
Well, of course, the honourable lady is absolutely right. If the law has been broken in this serious way that is alleged, then that will be a criminal offence. And therefore, this House, given a criminal offence, would have been committed in relation to a massive vote that has huge constitutional changes. Surely this is such a serious matter that you would have thought that right honourable and honourable members from all sides would have wanted not just to listen, but to participate. The honourable gentleman wanted to intervene.
Very grateful to the right honourable gentleman for giving away. Would he accept these points? That during the referendum campaign, the government was in favour of us remaining in the European Union, a position I shared. The Conservative Party took a corporate stance to be neutral in that referendum campaign. The Leave campaign, just as the Remain campaign, has ceased to exist as legal entities, and any allegations made against either campaigning organisation in that referendum is best dealt with by the Electoral Commission and not by Parliament. This is not for the government to answer, because this is not a government policy.
I find the intervention of the honourable gentleman rather odd. First of all, it's in the tradition that we're seeing this debate from the Conservative benches of a whataboutery statement. But also, surely I would have thought the honourable gentleman would have wanted this House to hear and debate these allegations. They are in the public domain, they are in the press, the public are talking about them, and it's vital that the elected members of this House get a chance to debate it. And that's why I'm so grateful for my right honourable friend for having won this debate, and how proud I am of the Liberal Democrats for actually calling this debate. And I give way to my right honourable friend and then the honourable gentleman.
I mean, just following that point of order, I mean, isn't it the case that the government, in fact, do need to answer, because some of the very prominent cabinet ministers were at the centre of these allegations?
Well, my right honourable friend anticipates a line of argument that I wish to come onto in due course. He's absolutely right, though, that the Foreign Secretary and the Secretary of State for DEFRA were closely involved in the Vote Leave campaign, and we need to know whether these allegations go indeed to the very top table. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
In the spirit of fairness, and I shouldn't be doing the Conservative bench's job for them, but the honourable member who probably has done more than most, and certainly more than me, and who knows more than most about this, is the chairman of the Digital Culture, Media and Sport Committee, who couldn't take part in the debate because he was hearing this vital evidence from Chris Wylie, and he will be doing his job, I'm sure, very adequately in front of the Prime Minister later this afternoon. We need to approach this in as consensual a way as we can, because this is not about party politics, it's about the integrity and the security of our electoral system.
I agree with the right gentleman, both about the efforts and expertise that the chair of the Select Committee is bringing to that inquiry and how important that is to this whole debate, but also the need to try to go across both party divisions and the divisions that we saw both in the referendum campaign and after the referendum campaign. I've been contacted by Leave voters who are very disturbed about these allegations. That many of the Leave voters, very patriotic people, believe that one of the key traditions and values of this country is that we respect the rule of law and that we do not allow cheats to prosper. And therefore, I do think, actually, this is an issue which can bring Parliament together and can bring both sides together. And whoever cheated during the referendum, if anyone cheated, they need to be held to account. I give way.
But with respect, he's not answered the point made by my honourable friend. And the point is this, that of course he's right. He's entitled to give his speech, Parliament's entitled to debate it. But the question we want him to answer is this. Who should decide? Who should decide whether to take action? Is it the government, which was party pre, which took one side of this debate during the referendum, or should it be an independent body, named the Electoral Commission? Who should make the final decision?
Of course, there could be a number of bodies that ultimately look at the different accusations. We have a live investigation by the Electoral Commission, and we await that. My right-hand friend spoke very much about the Electoral Commission in his opening speech. We have the investigations by the Information Commissioner and her office in relation to the related allegations with respect to Cambridge Analytica and aggregate IQ. So there are those investigations. Many of us feel that the evidence so far, because there could be a criminal act, suggests that the police should be investigating these organisations. I certainly am not suggesting, let me be absolutely clear, that government ministers are responsible for investigation. That would not meet my requirements for an inquiry, I can assure you.
On this point, doesn't he agree, and the point has been made previously, that yes, it is an independent body that investigates, but yes, maybe we actually need to update the law and do something here in Parliament in order to adequately respond to these things in the future.
Well, indeed, and what I believe Parliament can do, and indeed I've written to the chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee, Mr Speaker, to ask whether her committee could hold a parliamentary committee inquiry into the different aspects that aren't covered by the inquiry of the Select Committee for Culture, Media and Sport, because I seriously think that this House needs to augment and support those investigations by those independent bodies. We have powers in this House to bring people to the bar, to discuss, to give evidence, and I think that is the right and proper thing to do. I'm happy to give way.
Gentlemen, doesn't he also think it's an irony? The government who was so keen on the Lobbying Act to such a degree that small charities around the country were very frightened of intervening near elections. The same government that is introducing voter identification and all sorts of ID simply so that they'll catch the 29 people or however many it was that committed electoral fraud last time. And yet they seem remarkably lacking in concern over this.
I think the Honourable Lady makes a very good point. And the fundamental issue here is, did people in the Leave campaign cheat? It's this cheating issue. Did they break the law? And that's what we need to focus on. And it was the Honourable Gentleman Member for Swansea West who made the analogy with athletes and with sport. If athletes dope, Mr Speaker, we expect that to be investigated and then to be punished, whether or not that cheating affected the result of a race or any competition. And it's that cheating and the breach of the law that needs to be followed through, whether or not that relates to the outcome of the referendum. I give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
Would you agree with me that if government ministers, and I'm thinking specifically of the Foreign Secretary and the Environment Secretary, are implicated in any illegal activities, if they are the dopers in the analogy he's using, that they should not be above the law, and that when the police are doing their investigation, they should not be intimidated from putting forward a legal case against ministers, irrespective of their position in this place?
Well, in responding to the Honourable Gentleman, let us be clear, these are all allegations. We need proper authorities to investigate. But, of course, if those investigations go to the door of any member of this House, be they a minister or not, then, of course, the full weight of the law should go against that individual. No member of this House should be above the law in those investigations. But if I may, Mr Speaker, I want to be a little clearer than the debate's been so far about how we are thinking, or how the Electoral Commission, as key to this, would think about whether there has been cheating. Because the Electoral Commission's guidelines on this are quite clear about whether a campaign has colluded. And there are a number of tests they set out about whether campaigns are highly likely to be working together. And there are three criteria that they set out. First of all, whether the campaigns spend money on joint advertising campaigns, leaflets or events. That's the first one. Well, the evidence brought forward by Fair Vote, which can be seen by anyone at fairvote.uk, the evidence brought forward suggests that Vote Leave and Believe appear to have coordinated with the same digital strategy vendor, Aggregate IQ. So there does seem to have been a coordination between their advertising campaigns. The second test the Electoral Commission set forth is this: whether campaigns have coordinated their spending with another campaigner. The evidence produced by Fair Vote is very clear. It shows that Believe appears to have been assigned specific responsibility for the youth audience by Vote Leave. Specific responsibility by Vote Leave. That is coordination and collusion, Mr Speaker. And the third test on cheating set out by the Electoral Commission is whether another campaigner can approve or has significant influence over the spending of another campaign. And this dossier shows, again, that Believe was based at Vote Leave HQ, as we've heard, and appears to have reported to Vote Leave directors and shared all information with their staff. In other words, Mr Speaker, the three tests put forward by the Electoral Commission about whether illegal collusion occurred appear to be met according to the evidence in this dossier, which I do urge all right honourable members to read and to think about before they tweet in the way we saw for the Foreign Secretary, who dismissed these allegations as ludicrous at the weekend. Well, he might well have tried to dismiss them, Mr Speaker, because if these allegations prove to be true, if the investigations, inquiries that we all seek to want to follow on from this debate, from this public discussion, they may well want to ask the Foreign Secretary questions, because he was ultimately in charge of the Vote Leave campaign. He was a key player in the Vote Leave campaign. And people will want to know whether he knew about this collusion. Did he know that monies were going from Vote Leave to Believe? Did he know that the staff of both campaigns were colluding and working together? Did he know that Aggregate IQ was being used by both campaigns in a very similar way? Very serious allegations, but we need to see the independent inquiries. And the same questions, of course, could be applied to the Secretary of State for DEFRA. But I would also want, Mr Speaker, to ask the Prime Minister whether she has asked the Foreign Secretary, her Foreign Secretary, and her Secretary of State for DEFRA about what they knew. Because the Prime Minister ought to be, if she's in charge of her government, asking her very own ministers what they knew, given the severity and gravity of these allegations now in the public domain. And if she is not getting good enough answers from the Foreign Secretary and the Secretary for DEFRA, she should be taking action. There is another issue, Mr Speaker, with regard to what the Prime Minister's responsibilities, namely that she has key members of staff in Number 10 who are staffers in these campaigns who appear to be part of the alleged collusion. And at the very least, she should be asking them questions and getting assurances from them, and if those assurances aren't good enough, she should take the appropriate action, Mr Speaker. I would like to ask the Minister, does the Foreign Secretary speak for the government on this when he pushes aside these allegations as nonsense? Is that what the Minister is going to say at the dispatch box in a few minutes. Does she, speaking on behalf of Her Majesty's Government, agree with the Foreign Secretary that these allegations are all complete nonsense before they've been investigated? Before, Mr. Speaker, they've been investigated. This is quite an extraordinary position for Her Majesty's Government to take, and particularly for the Foreign Secretary to take. He's supposed to speak for this country about the rule of law in other countries, and one wonders, doesn't one? Would you give way? Happy to give way.
Does he not think it's also telling that the Foreign Secretary put out that statement as soon as the news broke on last Friday evening? He can't possibly have read the 3 huge files of documentation that have been presented to the Electoral Commission and the ICO of evidence, can he?
Well, one does wonder about people connected to the Vote Leave campaign who've tried to get in their rebuttals and their answers rather rapidly. We saw from the manager, the head of the Vote Leave campaign in terms of the staff side, Mr Dominic Cummings, putting a pre-rebuttal out before the allegations had been in the public domain. It sounds like he knew quite a lot of what the allegations were going to be. Perhaps he knew the truth, Mr Speaker. I'm afraid his pre-rebuttal did not convince anybody. And now we have the allegations and the detailed evidence of emails and photographs of things that have since been deleted. We now know why Mr Cummings was desperate to try to get his rebuttal in. And I can't know whether the Foreign Secretary was in the same position, but one has to have one's suspicions raised, Mr Speaker. So it's because these allegations are so grave, affecting the most momentous decision that this country has taken since the Second World War, that we are absolutely right from these benches, supported by all colleagues in the opposition, to ask these questions of the government. Just because there's no division after this debate, Mr Speaker, does not make these questions and this debate something that the government can push aside. I say to the Minister today, we will be coming back to this and back to this until we have answers. And when the Electoral Commission report, when the Information Commissioner's reports, and hopefully when the police report, then we will need to have those published and debated here again in this House. We will not let this lie. Why? Because we want to defend British democracy. We want to defend parliamentary sovereignty. We want to defend the rule of law. And I hope the Minister is going to go up to the dispatch box shortly and say that's what she's going to do too.
Thank you. Tommy Shepherd.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I congratulate the Right Honourable Member for Carshalton for bringing this debate today, and I find myself in agreement both with what he has said and with most of the speakers on these benches. I have a direct personal interest in this, Mr Speaker, not one I need to declare under the Code of Conduct, but because I have direct experience of operating in a campaign under the very regulations which we're talking about today. In the summer of 2014, I was an activist and a campaigner in the Scottish independence referendum. And because of my history and background in the entertainment industry, I was part of a group that was trying to coordinate that campaign amongst the arts and cultural industry in Scotland. And one of the things we wanted to do in that group was to organise a major high-profile concert in the run-up to the event in order to demonstrate the support that was there and in order to provide a fillip for the campaign in the final days. We went to the Yes Scotland campaign, which was the designated organisation with this proposal, and they said that it wasn't something they wanted to include in their campaign plan and spend money on, and they advised us to go away and do it ourselves. So that is what we did. And I registered my own events company with the Electoral Commission as a permitted participant in the organisation. We went, we hired the Usher Hall, the grandest concert hall in Edinburgh, we booked the bands, we arranged the production, we arranged the publicity, and we had a very successful event. And afterwards, we provided to the Electoral Commission a report and a detailed budget of what we had spent and the money that we had received. And at no stage did we either report to or seek the involvement of the official designated organisation. I'm happy to give way.
I thank him for giving way, and I'm sure that when he was considering what action to take, he would never, for instance, have considered co-locating with the designated organisation. He would never considered sharing a server. He would probably not have considered using the same supplier on the same basis as the designated organisation.
The Right Honourable Gentleman is a ahead of me, because I was going to say I have had cause over recent weeks to wonder, what if we had done it differently? What if, rather than do it that way, the designated campaign organisation had come to me and said, we'd like you to do this activity, and the best way to do it, because we don't want it in our budget, is we'll set up a separate organisation, and just to make it easier for you, our lawyers have done the paperwork in order to set up the organisation, and just to make it easier for you, you can have our staff and you can work out of our office, and just to make it even easier for you, you don't need to bother about writing the cheques, because we will book and pay for the hall and the production. What would have happened if we'd done it that way, I wonder? Well, I am in no doubts what would have happened. The Electoral Commission would have investigated. They would have found myself and, yes, Scotland in breach of the regulations. We would have been fined and we would have been reported to the Procurator Fiscal for prosecution and criminal charges. And I say that, Mr. Speaker, because that lived experience frames my opinion of these events that we're talking about today. And my opinion is that this stinks to high heaven. I have looked, in preparation for this debate, at the original investigation and judgments of the Electoral Commission to these complaints, and I would recommend members do this, at the High Court judgment on the application for judicial review of that decision. And what it comes down to, and what is absolutely central in this debate, is not whether there were different campaign organisations arguing for vote leave, but whether they colluded together in order to breach the expenditure limits that were set down. That is what is central to this. And if you look at the High Court judgment and other documents, it's clear that the most important thing here is whether or not there was a common plan in existence between vote leave and bee leave as defined under the 2000 Act. And I have to say that when you have a situation where vote leave sets up a subsidiary organisation called bee leave, uses its own personnel to go and establish it, manages to send its lawyers and all sorts of support, provides its offices and computers and drives on the server for the same people, then it is very, very difficult indeed to escape the conclusion that there was collusion and organisation between the two. We are being asked to believe that Darren Grimes took a £600,000 contract and went to a data analytics firm in Canada completely independently of people in vote leave who had already spent £2.7 million with the very same company. It is literally, Mr. Speaker, unbelievable. Right. And I think we need to support the Electoral Commission and others in investigating this to the bottom. Now, we are aware of this. I'm happy to give way if we have time.
For giving way, does he not agree with me that what would be even worse than any of this is if we come to the Electoral Commission comes to the conclusion that they can't prove it? And that says to me that there is something fundamentally wrong with the laws under which they are operating. And that is what this debate is about. How do we stop this from happening again, should they not be found to have been colluding?
Indeed, and I think we will have to wait the outcome of the Electoral Commission's investigation before we consider whether the legal framework and the support which is provided for the Electoral Commission is in fact adequate to this task. But I wanted to state also, Mr. Speaker, that we have this new evidence. I mean, the Electoral Commission had already reopened the investigation, by the way, before the whistle-blowing information that has come out in the last 7 days. But we are surely indebted to Shamir Sani for what he has done in the service of democracy in this country. And I've watched his video recordings, and it's clear that we don't share the same point of view. We didn't share the same point of view on Brexit during the campaign. We don't share it now. But I don't think that anyone who watches those interviews can fail to be moved by the decency, the integrity and the bravery of that young man in coming forward and putting himself at risk. And I think we owe him a great debt. And it does therefore worry me, the response of our government to these whistleblowing allegations. And others have mentioned this, but I think the Prime Minister's explanation yesterday that this was a personal statement made by Stephen Parkinson just doesn't hold water. How can it be a personal statement when someone is at a desk in number 10 Downing Street, at the heart of government, on the payroll, and issues a statement from number 10 Downing Street? This must be the first occasion in history, certainly that I can remember, where the government has decided to attack a whistleblower by outing them as gay, causing them the possibility of actual harm to themselves and their family, and it is a disgrace. Happy to go.
is he also aware that, according to reports, that statement was approved by the Prime Minister's Chief Communications Officer, Robbie Gibb? No way that that was not an official statement, as the Prime Minister claimed yesterday.
I agree, and on the email it says official. So, I mean, there can be no question that the Prime Minister didn't know what Stephen Parkinson was saying. And I have to say, I've written to the government today to demand that this young man be apologised to for the actions that have been taken. And I have to say, that is the very least that we can expect. Most reasonable people in this country will be wondering why Stephen Parkinson has not already been sacked, quite frankly. And in many other companies or areas of life, that is exactly what would happen. I'm happy to take a...
Giving way. Look, let the Electoral Commission do it. Why is this House trying to preempt it? No one should be sacked until we'd actually have a decision.
I was not talking about the Electoral Commission investigation just there. I was not talking about the allegations of collusion between Vote Leave and Believe. I was talking about a senior official of the government exposing somebody for being gay in response to them blowing the whistle on what has been happening in government. And that speaks to the character of this government, and they have, I think, hours rather than days to try and claw back in this and put something right. And I would hope when the Minister gets to her feet that she will make a statement that the government will respond to these concerns and will speak to Mr Parkinson and, if necessary, take the appropriate action. I have to say myself, I can't see any other action that would be possible but to say this man is no longer fit to hold office in government. Mr Speaker, what happens when the Electoral Commission has its investigation and comes to its conclusion? Well, of course, one of the things that happens is that even if the collusion is proven, even if the regulations have been breached, this is not going to change the result of the referendum. It will not be overturned. And, of course, there are some people on the pro-Brexit side who seem to believe that the referendum was mandatory on Parliament and the government. It never was in the first place. It was an advisory referendum. So even if its result were to be challenged, it doesn't actually call into question the many decisions in terms of Article 50 and leaving the European Union that this Parliament has already voted on. But I do believe, Mr Speaker, that it does add further poison to the well of British democracy, because it comes on top of the most mendacious campaign in political history that was fought in 2016, where people were lied to about what it meant to leave the European Union. And on top of that, not only were these lies told and written on the not worth the bus that they were written on, frankly, but we also now have a situation where the regulations and the laws governing the conduct of that may have been broken. Mr Speaker, I think the Minister needs to reassure us that the Electoral Commission will have all of the resources that they require in order to get to the bottom of this matter. But I have to say also, I think there is already enough evidence, because I presume these statements from the whistleblowers will be sworn to under oath. There is already enough evidence for this matter to be referred to the Crown Prosecution Service and for a police investigation to take part. And what that police investigation needs to do is to interview under caution the players in this debate, the players in this scenario, including those who now sit in government holding the highest offices of the land. Which brings me, Mr Speaker, to the Foreign Secretary, who has chosen not to be present here today. Others have commented about how quick off the mark the Foreign Secretary was to denounce the allegations, to denounce the new information. And I am left wondering whether this was just his attempt to be the English Donald Trump, or whether, in fact, this is someone using one of the highest offices of the land to bring their power and authority to bear to intimidate those who will criticise him and make these allegations. And that is very worrying indeed. And I want an assurance from the government today that if the Electoral Commission finds that there has been collusion and breach, then that those cabinet ministers who were involved in the management of the Vote Leave campaign will resign from office and will take no further part in government, because it would be ridiculous, and I think it would undermine the credibility of the Foreign Secretary and others to have been involved in this breach of our electoral law and to then seek to hold the the highest office of the land. And finally, Mr Speaker, I want to just refer to my honourable friend from Western Bartonshire raised a very important matter as well. Because I think as we uncover this, we will find more traces of dark money creeping into our electoral system. And we need to have the utmost transparency if we are to resist this. And so, therefore, I invite the Minister also to comment on what action she and her colleagues will be taking with regard to the Constitutional Research Council and the money that they have siphoned to the Democratic Unionist Party for the Brexit campaign. Because this is an organisation that has no website, no published report, no published accounts. This is the very definition of shady, and it's not something that we should accept in our democracy.
John Trickett.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank you very much for granting this debate this afternoon. We've heard a number of very important contributions, haven't we? It's difficult to disagree with any of them because nobody from the opposition on the government bench has actually bothered to speak, although they attempted to prick the arguments from time to time. Look, however you voted on the referendum, or whatever your views are now, the recent revelations in connection with the Brexit campaign raise very serious questions about the function of our democracy, go right to the heart of who we are as a country. In truth, let me start by saying this. We could not even be holding this debate if it were not for the hard work, the courage, the diligence and the honesty of journalists working for our media. It's a profession which politicians rarely thank, journalists, but also whistleblowers. However uncomfortable it may be for the powerful in our society, and for any of us, it's clearly essential for the function of a democracy that we protect the respective roles both of journalists and of whistleblowers. It demeans our politics, therefore, to attempt to destroy a whistleblower's case, not by addressing the matters which were being raised, but by insinuating a malicious personal motive on the part of the whistleblower. And it's especially sinister. Indeed, it was shameful, when those insinuations emerged from Downing Street, as we've heard, and when their source was then defended by the Prime Minister personally. After all, the government has a policy on whistleblowing. It's quite clear. It's on the government website this afternoon. It says, as a whistleblower, you are protected by the law. You should not be treated unfairly or lose your job because you blow the whistle. But Mr Sani has been untreated unfairly in a way which is absolutely disgraceful. And democracy depends on more than just journalists and whistleblowers. It needs transparency. It needs a rules-based, level playing field. If these attributes of transparency and a level playing field are missing, then our democracy will be in severe danger, and I believe it may well be. The stakes have never been higher because the referendum itself was a major constitutional turning point in this country's history. And the House will not forget that the Leave campaign was headed by two distinguished members of this House, who arguably now owe their membership of the British Cabinet to the role they played in the Brexit campaign. They say, don't they, Mr Speaker, to the victor belong the spoils. But it's too soon yet to draw any firm conclusions that the vote Leave itself broke the rules, but there are clearly reasons to worry. And before reciting some of the known facts, let's remind the House that the law on referenda, which we passed, doesn't prevent donations from one campaign body to another, but it does forbid collusion between them, because otherwise there would not be a level playing field between the two sides on the referendum. If one campaign exceeds a spending cap by deliberately and perhaps surreptitiously spawning satellite or puppet operations, then that crucial principle of equity between the two parties is then lost. So I just want to list quickly what we do now know, some of which has been mentioned but others haven't. Let me just quickly go through it. Vote Leave raised more money than the statutory spending cap. 1. 2. They donated surplus funds to other campaigning bodies, amongst which were the youth body called Believe. 3. These two campaigns shared the same building. 4. There was a revolving door between the staff of the two organisations. They then both used the same small Canary-based company, AIQ, whose purpose seems to have been to harvest data from social media in order to target Leave messaging to British voters. By a strange coincidence, Leave.eu, the campaign led by Messrs Farage and Banks, amongst others, also used the very same Canadian firm. And by the way, there are at least two other bodies, which have been mentioned briefly today, which received donations from Vote Leave. One was Veterans for Britain, and the other, though they're not in their place, was the DUP. The DUP also received money. What's remarkable, a remarkable coincidence, is that both the Veterans for Britain and the DUP reportedly used the same firm, AIQ, the small firm based in Canada, I'm told, above a shop. I will very briefly, but we want to try to finish in reason.
For Britain, is he aware that they are consistent giving evidence to the Defence Select Committee and above some of the comments I made earlier during the debate, there is now grave concern about the links to national security in this very debate?
I think the honourable member makes the point which speaks for itself. Well, look, so far so good. Those are the facts as I understand them. But until last week, there was evidence that the various Leave campaigns were rubbing shoulders with each other, often in the same office, but not that there was specific collusion. But this is where the recent revelations which have brought this debate to take place today from the whistleblower change the nature of our understanding of what had happened. Because Mr Sani was right at the core of the Believe organisation from its very inception. Indeed, I understand he was the treasurer, although he says he never actually saw the money pass through the accounts. He had previously worked in the Vote Leave organisation, and he says he was directed by them to join Believe. He further goes on to say that Believe was established by Vote Leave, that the money which it donated was in effect under the control not of Believe but of senior members of Vote Leave staff. And he goes on to argue that the money which was donated by Vote Leave allegedly to Believe actually was directed by Vote Leave to be spent on AIQ. If these allegations of collusion are true, then they amount to a serious breach of the regulations and to a de facto fusion of the two campaign groups. And therefore, one has to assume under those circumstances there was an illegal spend by Vote Leave/Believe of about 10% of the total statutory cap. That was illegal. And yet a further allegation has been made, because it said that after the referendum, Vote Leave staff then destroyed or doctored the electronic data files which they held in order to remove any reference to an interconnection between the two campaigns. It's hard to conclude other than that this was a puppet campaign designed to avoid electoral law. If there was nothing to hide, why would they destroy or change the files? Mr Speaker, given the historic scale of the referendum, what it presaged for our country, we must have a proper and urgent investigation. But the truth is that this House is not the proper place to carry out such an investigation. And let's be blunt about the reason why. It's because the government is in it up to its neck. Two cabinet ministers fronted the organisation. There they sit week after week. The Bonnie and Clyde of Brexit. And I'll leave it to the House to decide who is Bonnie and who is Clyde out of the two of them. But the way in which they then had a pantomime swag bag, allegedly full of £350 million a week for the NHS, turned out to be completely, as we know, untrue. Meanwhile, the sheriff herself, in the shape of the Prime Minister, had publicly defended her own political secretary after his personalised attack on the whistleblower. They cannot represent themselves as honest brokers. So who will step up to carry out the investigation of these new revelations? Clearly, it must be the Electoral Commission and, if necessary, the police. At present, the Commission are under-resourced and lack necessary powers to carry out the task. After all, the situation of last week with the Information Commissioner revealed how limited the powers and resources are to that organisation in trying to get access to Cambridge Analytica files. We, on this side, now demand that the government recuse itself from looking into these matters and commission a wholly independent investigation instead. The EC should be given the extra powers and resources it needs to follow the evidence wherever it takes them. They should then report to this House and to the public directly, so that there is no suspicion of interference by interested parties in powerful places. Mr. Speaker, I'll finish with this point. Sunlight, as we've been told many times, is the best disinfectant. We've seen the Prime Minister, beholden to the extreme wing of her party, who are running wild and unchecked. If she wants to stand up for our democracy and to show she has nothing to hide, she will surely now work with any investigation as a matter of urgency.
Just before I call the Minister to reply on behalf of the Government, I just gently make the point that in conformity with convention, and she's a most courteous Minister, she'll seek to allow a minute or two for the Right Honourable Gentleman, Member for Carshalton and Wallington, to conclude. Thank you. I call the Minister. Chloe Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and of course I shall, with pleasure, leave time for the Right Honourable Member to conclude the debate. Mr. Speaker, there are two things I think I ought to begin this debate by saying. The first is this. As a Minister, I shall respect the integrity of independent investigations and so will not comment here today on allegations that rightly belong with the ICO or the Electoral Commission for investigation. I do hope that honourable and right honourable members will join me in respecting that rather important legal principle, and I set it out here at the beginning of my remarks to help the House with that clarity. Secondly, as the Minister responsible for the electoral system, I am actually, Mr. Speaker, proud to say that the UK has a clear and robust electoral system. We should all be proud of the democracy in which we live and work. I would actually like to place on record my thanks to all involved in the electoral community who work so hard at every poll to deliver it within the law, such that we can be proud of our democracy. Now, turning to the EU referendum, the Electoral Commission concluded that it was a well-run poll and that it was delivered without any major issues. Now, we also know that it was one of the largest democratic exercises in our history. I recognise, indeed we've seen it here today, that that referendum and its subject matter elicits high emotion. It elicits high emotion on both sides and clearly continues to do so. But with 17.4 million votes to leave the European Union, more people voted for Brexit than have ever voted for anything else in the UK. We, therefore, have to respect the will of the people from that referendum, and we are delivering it. So this government, Mr. Speaker, is committed to ensuring the best possible outcome for the British people in the negotiations to leave the EU.
I thank the Minister for giving way, and she's just repeated a line which the Prime Minister used to dismiss my inquiries regarding this matter yesterday. But given that some of her Downing Street staff are the subject of these allegations and use disgraceful House of Cards-style tactics to divert attention by outing a whistleblower as being gay, and given that there are senior cabinet ministers that led the Vote Leave campaign, doesn't the Prime Minister have, and her government, have a number of questions to answer outside of the Electoral Commission investigation, a number of questions to answer regarding these events?
Mr. Speaker, I won't be adding anything in this debate to what the Prime Minister had to say yesterday on those issues, but I will turn to the matters at hand under this application today. And I'd like to thank the House for its comments in the course of today's debate. Now, there have been various allegations, of course, that have come out into the media over the past week. I think it is important to be clear about what those involve, which are directly linked to the UK's electoral law and which may not be. Now, first of all, there were a series of allegations about Cambridge Analytica using Facebook data to profile American voters. Now, that matter is primarily a data protection issue. It is a serious allegation, and the Information Commissioner is undertaking a formal investigation using its powers. The Government is strengthening the remit of the Information Commissioner through the Data Protection Bill by giving it tougher powers to ensure organisations comply with its investigations, including the ability to impose significant fines. We will consider the Information Commissioner's proposal for further powers as the bill passes through Parliament. Secondly, There have also been allegations about whether some of the spending ahead of the EU referendum was properly declared. Now, some of those matters have already been subject to Electoral Commission investigations. Others may well be so in due course. And I return to the point I made at the beginning, Mr. Speaker, that I shall not comment on investigations that are being carried out. In this country, the Electoral Commission is the independent body which oversees the conduct of elections and referendums and regulates political finance. It is that commission which reports regularly on the running of elections and referendums, conducts thorough investigations into allegations that rules have been breached. Does he have a better one than he had last time?
Given that the points that I made were about the conduct of Downing Street staff and her ministers, this is not about the Electoral Commission. This is about the Prime Minister's integrity and the judgment about appointing those staff.
Mr. Speaker, I regret to say that he seems to be under a misunderstanding about the debate that you have granted in the place this afternoon, which is, after all, about electoral law. So, as the Minister responsible for electoral law, I shall answer on that point. What I will go on to say is this. The Commission, the Electoral Commission, is independent of government. It is, indeed, accountable to Parliament via, Mr. Speaker, your committee on the Electoral Commission, the Speaker's Committee on the Electoral Commission. Now, one important thing that has come up in the debate today, which I think is really worth picking up at this point of my remarks, some have suggested today that the Electoral Commission is under-resourced. I would encourage honourable members to take a look at the Electoral Commission's operating costs of this year, which show an underspend against its anticipated budget. Indeed, in January of this year, they returned funds. Now, I leave it to others to then draw conclusions from that about whether the Commission is resourced correctly or not. But I would say again, the Electoral Commission is accountable to Parliament, and those are questions that Parliament and, Mr. Speaker, your committee could rightly look into. To safeguard elections, it is... I will make progress because we do have to finish this debate on time, of course. It is time limited. To safeguard elections, it is vital to have an independent regulator. The Electoral Commission needs to be able to act independently without government interference. I'm a little disappointed by the Honourable Member for Hemsworth's rather loose thinking, I think, where he says that the government... I think his argument is, first of all, that the government ought to have been able to investigate these things, but then he thinks that's not correct. And then he says, oh, well, as a fallback, the Electoral Commission will do it instead. Let me be absolutely clear. It is a good thing that in this country we have that independent regulator. We cannot have it both ways. The independent regulator should do its independent job. I have heard too many arguments put in the chamber this afternoon that suggest that, in fact, what we ought to be doing in this House somehow is preempting the Electoral Commission's work. We should not do so. And as I said at the outset of my remarks, I will not do so. Allegations have been made about campaigners at the EU referendum. The specific allegations about spending rules and the accuracy of campaigners' spending falls squarely within the remit of the Electoral Commission. It has announced investigations into various campaigners at that referendum. It has already investigated a number of complaints and found no wrongdoing in those. It will publish its findings in due course. Now, as the Right Honourable Member who requested this debate, and I thank him for having brought it to this place, as he acknowledged yesterday, there may be sub judice issues here, and he quite rightly used that point in his application for this debate. It will not, and again I repeat myself here, it would not be appropriate for me or the government to comment on any ongoing investigations from that point. Now, let me turn instead to what might happen after that, because a number of points have been raised this afternoon about what might be the next steps from there.
Could she address the concerns raised by me, but also by the whistleblower Christopher Wiley, who spent a great deal of time with the Information Commission this week, that they don't have the resources or the expertise they need to do these investigations properly?
I think the honourable gentleman is asking me as to whether the Information Commissioner has the resources. Is that what he's asking? Yes, and the expertise. OK, I understand the point. Now, he will appreciate, first of all, and I know he's a very senior and experienced member of this House, he will appreciate that I'm here to answer about electoral law, such was the title of the debate. But it is important, of course, that these issues do come together. He will have seen my honourable friend, the Minister for the Data Protection Bill, joining with me to listen to part of this debate. And I think he will know from his expertise that the government is seeking to give the Information Commissioner stronger powers, for example, around warrantry, around compulsion, potentially looking at sanctions, and that the government is considering doing even more after the Cambridge Analytica allegations that have been brought out. And I believe that will have been made clear to members of the Data Protection Bill Committee, on which I don't sit, but which members of the House will have done. Now, as to whether the Information Commissioner has the expertise within that, I would certainly hope that they do, but I shall ask my honourable friend to contact him to ensure that he has that answer to his satisfaction. Let me conclude, Mr. Speaker, because time is coming to that point. Now, allegations that the rules may have been breached, the electoral law rules may have been breached, would rightly be a cause for concern, are rightly a cause for concern. But this does not necessarily follow that the rules themselves were flawed, and I do not think it is right to reach any conclusions on such an issue until the investigations of the Electoral Commission are complete. It wouldn't be right to jump to conclusions or start to amend the system, attempt to amend the system, before any allegations have been proven. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, the Government will continue to work closely with the Electoral Commission, along with many other stakeholders in the electoral system, to protect the integrity and security and effectiveness of referendums and elections. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, we will, let me make this very clear for the record today, we will continue to implement this referendum's result and to make a success of it.
Tom Brake. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I start by thanking you indeed again for facilitating this debate. The Minister in her response said that she would not be drawn on the allegations that have been referred to the Electoral Commission and the police, although she did then go on to say that we have a clear and robust electoral system. And I would perhaps gently chide the Minister. She might want to wait for the outcome of these investigations to see whether, in fact, we do have the clear and robust electoral system that she suggests that we have. She also would not comment on the actions of the Prime Minister's political officer. Now, that, as a number of members have said, is not a matter that is sub judice. I think it is a matter of morals and the actions that were taken which have exposed someone to risk. And I think that we might actually read into the fact that the Minister didn't want to respond to that. In perhaps her view might be that, in fact, that's something that the Prime Minister should look at very carefully and consider very carefully the position of that member of staff. Now, we've had very many challenging contributions from the opposition benches. Silence from the other side, apart from the Minister, apart from a few interventions. I asked the Minister a few specific questions at the end, which she did not answer, so I hope she will be able to do that in writing, specifically about whether there is the need for any legal reforms. And I must say, to conclude, Mr. Speaker, that I don't think anyone on the opposition benches today will be leaving reassured that the law wasn't broken and that the people weren't cheated, but we'll have to wait for the outcome of the inquiry to see whether these allegations are true or false.
Oh, very well. I'm going to put the question first, and then we'll come to the right honourable gentleman's point of order. The question is that this House has considered the EU referendum and the alleged breaches of electoral law. As many as are, that opinion say aye. Aye. On the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.